this next session. It's about GRC data, and let me quickly introduce our speakers for today. So we have Jamie Thompson, right?
Yep.
Jamie Thompson, Director of Technology for Risk Consulting for KPMG. Jamie has over 14 years experience within the assurance and advisory experience within KPMG, right?
Yep.
And we have Sophie Hyatt. So I'm working for KPMG for 9 years, part of the dynamic risk assessment team. So, and then we are based in London as well, and you will lead us and guide us through this session. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you. Right, okay. So, in terms of today's session, we're going to touch on the introductions and objective of the session. Provide you some GRC perspectives and insights in terms of what we've seen from the marketplace from a technology perspective, but also from a data perspective. That leads us into intelligence. So obviously I'm not doing that session, Sophie's doing that one. Then we come into integration, where we're going to talk about data and GRC integration. And then any open discussion and questions. But if you have any questions as we're going through these slides, feel free to interrupt and interject and ask as we go along. Try and make it as interactive as possible. I thought it was quite interesting in terms of some of the themes that we're developing in the first few sessions of the conference today, talking about intelligence and big data, analytics, etc. So we'll give you a bit of our view in terms of what we see in the marketplace in those, and what we see that works in practice. Okay.
Sorry.
No problem. Okay. So first things first. Let's talk about GRC Insights. So this is a view in terms of what we're seeing in the marketplace for GRC, and I'm sure some of these terminologies and characteristics equally apply to yourselves. So we've talked a lot about technology today at the event, and some of these are some key themes that we see in the marketplace from a GRC perspective. So we've seen a desire within the UK for compliance transformations. You know, what we've seen in the UK is generally catching up with the US marketplace in terms of GRC and compliance. We're seeing lots of concern regarding conduct risk, particularly in financial services. So we're seeing some more, I would call, snooping in terms of conduct information, conduct data, you know, where we're looking at emails and we're looking at phone calls in terms of to spot any areas where conduct isn't quite aligned to the policy. We've talked a lot about data, and the theme of this session is about data analytics in terms of what we see there. Reputational and third-party risk cyber. Cyber remains a hot topic in the GRC space, and that was echoed today. And then we obviously have the increase in and complexity of regulations and regulatory enforcement, you know, coming in financial service, but also touching things such as data privacy. I think the session next door is talking about data privacy in general. And what we're seeing is more data privacy transformations underpinned by GRC technology as well. And that all rests itself in terms of a holistic view of risk, covering strategy. So how do we embed risk into decision making on strategy? Transforming the organisation, the risk culture from a GRC perspective, and more convergence, particularly across siloed organisation. And we touch on some of those themes. And what we're going to show you a little later on is talk about what we call dynamic risk assessment, which talks about some of the interconnectivity of risks in terms of how you can spot velocity of risks. And I'm biased, so this is technology. So I'm from a technology background, but a number of these aspects are underpinned by technology. Well, it'll be GRC technology, well, it'll be data analytical capability. You know, there's lots of technology that underpins everything that we do. And to give you a bit of an example of that, in terms of, if you look at KPMG, we're obviously known for doing external audit. And under audit rotation, there's a lot of proposals that we do to our clients about external audit. And a key component of that is in terms of how do we understand the risk of that organisation, and how do we use data analytics to drive the quality of our audit opinion. So second to none, all our external audit pitches will have quite a large component about data analytics. And it's mainly in the financial and controls perspective, but it's a key part in terms of how we deliver our audits going forward. So we get more efficiency and more quality of our audit opinion. So we're seeing it on the ground at our clients, you know, that data analytics is key. Any questions in terms of trends in the risk marketplace? Do they all resonate? Okay. And then in terms of looking at it from a GRC trend perspective, these are the typical things that we see when we talk about GRC in our clients over the last number of years. Issue tracking, changing the operating model to adopt technology. We've talked about the extended enterprise and third parties, operational risk management, investing in GRC technology. Give me a second. Okay, and then obviously we've got things like digital. So these are what we call I would say the traditional GRC components that we see time and time again. But now when we talk to our clients, we're starting to talk about, they want more insights in terms of, from what they're doing from a risk perspective. Continuous monitoring of issues and risks within the organisation, not doing a risk exercise every 6 months and coming up with the top 10, top 15 risks. Interconnectivity of risks. So how do we understand how these risks are all linked together to provide a more coherent picture across the risks, and that's the one thing that Sophie's going to focus on now. Predictive analytics in terms of cognitive analytics. So there's a lot of talk about that, and it probably still remains talk, but we're going to see trends in that marketplace in that area, and to be more integrated. So when we talk about GRC and data analytics, and we've got a slide later on coming up, is that there will have to be some integration between data analytic tools, technologies, capabilities, and how they integrate into a GRC platform. A GRC platform isn't going to do everything an organisation does right across the board in terms of data as well as risk. And we'll give you some examples in terms of where we see some of those touch points between GRC and data analytics. And then finally, how you architect these solutions. We talked about having silo approaches to risk and to governance. So an organisation needs to architect a roadmap for GRC to make sure that everything's all interconnected. So risk links to control, that links to compliance to get some of the efficiencies and benefits from GRC technology from both a business perspective and from a stakeholder perspective. So they are some of the trends. So any challenges to those trends? I don't know if anybody wants a view in terms of what they're seeing at their own organisation. Is it a lot more talk in terms of the predictive integrated? Do they resonate in terms of trends?
One thing I haven't seen of those loss events or operational events.
Right, yes, in terms of scenario analysis and etc. So when we talk about operational risks, we tend to put them into that category. In terms of that, but any views from what your experience is in terms of loss events?
No, I mean, if you go on the trends, it's just basically when you think about the insights and integrated architecture, so seeing the whole end-to-end process from risk to a loss event and back, how can you change the content of a risk or control to avoid a loss event in the future in different areas?
Yeah, and what we see at our clients in terms of that scenario is quite, I would say, reactive. So the loss, so a loss happens, and it happens, but it's not very predictive. So what our clients are starting doing is just doing a roadmap for one company at the minute, and they're starting to think in terms of how can we be a bit more futuristic in terms of how we can predict those losses happening in the first place, rather than they have an incident now and they react to it and do something about it, but they don't predict that where it's going to happen in the next part of their business, which I think will evolve over time, and trying to use previous data to inform the future, but also bring in some external perspectives on that data as well.
But just a side question, do you know if we can have access to these slides after
Yep.
they can be available?
So all these slides you can have access to. The ones that we touch on interconnectivity and risk, we can't share those ones, but you'll be able to obviously see them as you go along. But the rest of the slides you'll be able to have. Okay, anything else in terms of trends? Okay. And data insights. So obviously we've been talking a lot about data in the conference in terms of how important big data is, cognitive, etc., etc. So, what we see at our clients, and you may well resonate with yourselves, is maturity and capability is rising, but there's still a struggle in this space to drive some real value from doing big data and data analytics. So again, there seems to be a lot of talk. It's better than what it was, but there's still a lot of work to do. And this is evidenced in terms of our own surveys, with only 20% are satisfied with insight from DNA. So, in terms of data analytics, it's still quite a lot of work to do to get the business consumers and consumptions of data to be happy. And that's why it's important, as when you think about scoping or shaping GRC and data analytics, it needs to be on a fairly focused use case. Some people go into it doing a big, massive data program, but actually they'll never get anything from it. So, still lots of work to do. And then difficulty in evaluating data quality. So any predictive or any routine data analytics requires a baseline of data quality within that data. So if you've got poor quality data that you're analysing, you're going to make some poor quality decisions based on that data. So whenever we do this capability, we always make sure we understand what the data exceptions are and where the quality gaps are to make sure that we're, we can make the right decisions. And then finally, in organisations, the capability and talent for producing, performing the technology tools around data analytics is insufficient capability, only at 14%. So there's maybe great drives from a business to actually do data, but actually you can be constrained in terms of the capability of the organisation to do that and do it quickly. The great thing about data, and we've seen this in our audit work and in our risk work, is that, if it's accurate and the quality's there, it does tell a story. So you can't argue in terms of when you see this data being transactioned. And it also looks at the past and also the present. And it's powerful enough to shape the future, which we'll talk about in a minute. So that's an overview of data, GRC and data insights. Now, hands up in your organisation, who's got a data analytic capability or seen projects on big data within your organisation? 1, 2, 4. Any views in terms of how it's gone so far?
Well, generally difficult because the data sources are totally all over the place, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And
similar, we got data, collected the data and tested it and running with it, but make this an ongoing process. The feeds have to be continuous.
yes.
Therefore, the data is too much.
Okay. So it starts as a project and ends as a project, but it's not continuous, not embedded in terms of how you operate. Any other thoughts or insights?
We're using IBM Watson.
Okay. Yeah.
But again, all the proof of concepts we're launching, a lot of the work we have to do is training Watson
Yeah.
in order to then get the insights back.
Mm.
And it takes a lot of effort to train it.
Yeah.
And some of the baseline data they have that they can use modelling on isn't very, the quality is quite poor.
Yeah.
For example, we were trying to do some work on control analytics, and it was looking at the data, and we had a category called arts and crafts,
Okay.
because it looked at the word modelling, and in this data dictionary we linked that to modelling from an
Arts and crafts. Yeah.
That's just like, it takes a bit of training to work with it, so it actually means something else. And that, it was just basically they were using their out-of-the-box features. So
Yeah.
It's not there, it's not some kind of silver bullet to fix it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what we've seen in terms of our maturity about data. And actually, so if you speak to Gartner, when they talk about their GRC framework, we've got like legal, finance, operations. Right in the heart of it is risk analytics. So they say, going forward, risk analytics will be right at the heart of GRC going forward. And obviously IBM, for example, are pushing Watson quite a lot for GRC analytics, but probably quite a bit of work to do in that space as well. Okay, so in terms of intelligence, so we're just giving you an example in terms of some of the tools and techniques that we've used from a dynamic risk perspective. So I'll hand you across to Sophie.
Thank you, Jamie. So I'm going to talk to you about something we launched at KPMG recently called Dynamic Risk Assessment. And you're probably wondering why I'm standing in front of you talking about it today. I think everybody would agree that the world we operate in and the risks we're trying to manage is not the same environment we had 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even yesterday. We're in a much more connected world. The pace of change is a lot faster than we're used to managing. We just heard about the need for continuous data and how to manage that. So if I was to ask you how you manage your risk environment today, I think most people would respond and would say they would look at it in a typical two-dimensional manner with severity, likelihood. And in this diagram, because we all work in a resource-constrained environment, we probably would only try and manage effectively the risks in the top right-hand corner. Would everybody agree with that as a rough approach? So in this scenario, we probably would only focus on maybe the top 4 risks if we had limited resources to action. So what dynamic risk assessment does do, and only KPMG has this modelling capability. It incorporates 2 more dimensions into the way we look at risk. So how risks connect to each other, and once we know how they connect to each other, what the systemic risk impact and the velocity of those risks and how they talk to each other. So what I want to do now is take you through an example of how the insights under DRA can provide more to your business. So I'm going to take away the risk descriptions because they're not really important for this example, and actually where the risks sit in the risk depiction is the important piece. So what I need everyone to do is just think about a luxury brand. Anything that comes to mind, handbags, cars. So this scenario is based on a luxury brand environment. And what I want you to do is pick a risk. So for this example, we all focus on this risk here. So it probably would get some attention because it's in the top right-hand corner of your severity likelihood graph. But that's all you can really take from this depiction. So what if I was to tell you I could provide you more insight into the impact that risk has on your environment? So if we convert it, you will see now that this risk sits at the center of your risk network. So what I want to do very quickly is just talk about how to interpret this picture that I put in front of you today. So if you go back to high school maths and you think about your X and Y axes and how they meet at the origin is really at the center of your graph. So this depiction here shows you the risks that are most connected at the center of your picture. So this risk here, which is the inability to command luxury pricing, really is your most connected risk in your risk environment. So we've now learned a little bit more about this risk and what it can do to your risk environment. There's more that I can tell you about this picture. So we can mathematically depict risk clusters. So a risk cluster is risks that connect more to themselves than to any other risk in this environment. But why do you care about that? And the reason why we should care about that is because the lines in this diagram show you how risks flow around your network. So the thin end and the thick end mean something. So if you take the inability to command luxury pricing, you'll see all the thick ends flowing into that. That shows the direction of travel of how risk can influence risk in that environment. So in a risk cluster, we know that those 3 risks talk to each other. So if one could occur, it could trigger or have a knock-on impact to the other risks in the environment. So if I take you back to the severity likelihood graph, we cannot tell that from this picture. One of these risks does sit in the top right-hand corner, but the other 2 sit down here in a less severe, less likely environment. But we now know that these risks could trigger one another, and therefore maybe less monitored or less controlled risk will have and can have a knock-in impact on one of your most severe, most likely risks. Applying more mathematics to this environment, we can then calculate the combined severity and likelihood of this risk cluster. So what we see here is the combined risk clustering has a greater impact than any other risk in your risk environment. So providing, once again, more insight into your traditional risk view. What else can this graph tell you? So this is a mathematical depiction of an underlying model. It's not something we've just drawn together by asking around. There's a deep process of how to illicitly collect the right data from you and your organizations. But now we know that these risks talk to each other, we probably would like to know which risk can't go wrong and which risk has to go right. So because this is based on mathematics, we can mathematically solve that problem. So we can work out, using the red arrow, which is the risk that's most likely to have the biggest impact on your network. So if we wanted to make sure one risk didn't go wrong, this would be the risk in your network, because the way that the risks flow around a network, it had the biggest impact. Like any math problem, we can always invert it to find the opposite, the most influential. So the way I like to think about it, if I was Hillary Clinton standing in front of you today and I could only speak to one of you in the room to give you my message to why you should vote for me, you'd want to find the most influential person who has the biggest impact on that network. So we can mathematically solve that for a risk network too. So in this scenario, the risk here is internal obstacles slow us down. So if you're thinking about these risks in isolation, probably your biggest that you worry about, because they're generally internal in this scenario. But actually, if you could get how to manage internal obstacles correctly managed, it will stem the flow around your systemic network the fastest and have the biggest impact to managing our risks. Just a little bit more on the risks. So why do we care? It's because we live in a connected world, and we know that risks don't operate in isolation, and they can all have a knock-on impact with each other. And I just like this picture because I feel like it sums things up very nicely in the world that we operate in. And we know that we operate in a connected world, so why don't we look at our risks in a connected way and how they talk to each other rather than a standalone basis and trying to manage it that way? I went through that quite quickly. Happy to take questions or go back. Conceptually, does that resonate? Yeah.
Yes, so that's just a question. What's the input data? Could you give some example on the input data to kind of
Yeah.
get an idea on how faulty that may be in order for you to draw the wrong conclusion on the network?
Okay, so there was a study that happened over 5 years, and what it was trying to test is whether grey matter is better than a model. So each year they got the best economists in the world and the best executives in the world to make predictions about the world going forward. And over 5 years, the board members outperformed the economic models. I'll say 10 to 1, I don't know what the actual outcome was. So what that proves to us is that expert insight is the most valuable insight a company has. We're operating in an environment that we don't have data points for. You know, we hadn't had Brexit before, we hadn't had quantitative easing before, we might have Trump going forward. We just don't know, we don't have the data points of that. But what we do have is grey matter and grey hair and experience. So what we take our data points for is we use a whole range of social sciences to use expert elicitation to extract the best thinking about what could be your risk list out of your board level or your executive or your leadership. And then once we have that complete risk list, we then get them to answer 3 questions. How they think those risks connect to each other, how likely they are, and how quickly they can connect to each other. And with those data points, we then run it through our model to mathematically depict the network I just showed you. So there's a lot of math behind it, but the actual process is relatively quite simple. Yeah.
When you say how quickly they connect to each other, what do you mean with that? I know the first one, likelihood and impact.
Yeah.
How quickly they connect together, that's a new concept.
Yeah, so a risk might take 3 or 4 years to occur and have an impact, or it could take 2 to 3 weeks. So the velocity piece is trying to set a parameter against the speed that risk could materialize or have an impact on your organization. And we do that by asking how quickly you think it could happen. Any other questions?
So does anybody look at interconnectivity of risk as part of maybe a strategic risk process or an operational risk process, or is it the typical 3x3 or 5x5 risk model?
I was just going to say, so your capital work, you try to look at correlations, but not necessarily at a granular risk level.
Yeah.
And this is kind of related, but how often do you get results of the most influential risks that sit so way off your traditional top right-hand corner that people just don't buy it, that's what they should be focused on, for example?
It really depends on the organisation and what risk you're looking at. So we've done this on, at an enterprise level, and we've also done it at sort of a risk project level as well, depending on risk. I think there's always more insight to see how they talk to each other differently. Sometimes it just plays back to you what you already know, but you get comfort in that because you've kind of understood your environment. And there are obviously scenarios like this where it did have a different impact and made them think differently about the risk environment. A lot of it comes down to as well about how you think about your risk and how open you are to thinking about it could be influenced by other things. Bad info in, you get bad info out. So we have done scenarios where people haven't really thought about it and really engaged, and therefore it just replays what they already kind of assured themselves they would get. So it does involve you, and that's why a lot of it is all about the social science piece at the front and thinking about risk differently and what mega trends are coming up in the future that could really influence your risk environment.
So how do you manage the fact that obviously risks become more and less correlated over time, depending on scenarios? Do you consistently go through re-establishing those correlation values, or?
So we would do this at a point in time, and then what we can do is, depending how often you want to run it, you'd then compare the two environments. We do get a lot of value in how things change and how the connections changed. I've seen organisations in the space of a year have a completely different environment about how they think differently about their organisation and the risks that face them. So it really depends on how frequent you want to do it.
You have to run the exercise again.
Yeah.
Build a mechanism that says overlay your strategic plan against your connectivity model, or whatever you call it.
So one capability we are building out is how to actively monitor the risks once you have the network. And a lot of that is done on getting the right data feeds in to be continuous to compare it against. So it's something we're working on, but it takes time. But as the data feeds into the depictions are from people within the organisation, it depends how rapidly it's changing.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Well, if you have 3 risks or whatever,
Yeah.
they are somehow clustered. You have connected those somehow,
Yeah.
and in the impact and likelihood,
Yeah.
they move both to the right and up in a way.
Yeah.
How do you determine that?
So I'm not the mathematician.
Not
Yeah.
all risks materialize at the same time.
No.
This one materializes a bit, the other one a bit.
Yeah.
If they were fully materializing,
Yeah.
it would be larger.
Yeah, it would, and it's all about understanding the concept that if you agree that risks connect to each other and risks have a flow-on effect, and the way that we've depicted mathematically the risk clusters, there's a greater likelihood that they would occur at the same time or have a knock-on impact. The mathematics behind it is from a new concept called Choquet integrals. I'm not a mathematician, so I can't explain that to you, but I'm happy to have that conversation afterwards, but it's based around those principles.
When I learned all of this, we were told to normalize the risk so they don't have much of an influence against each other. Are you recommending that this is still the case, that we break it down so they don't have much of an influence, or should we actually purposely seek out these connected risks and create a few more?
Also, create more connections.
Well, I was so far avoiding risks that are connected to each other, right? But if you have a method now to deal with it,
Yeah.
maybe the idea is a good one, to bring out more those that are connected and not avoid
Yeah.
the fact that two might be connected.
Yeah, so what we're trying to do is actually forcing those connections and pulling it together so you do know and you have a true picture of how your risk environment operates as a whole rather than in isolation as standalone risks. So the maths would always give you a full risk picture. Does that answer your question?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
So in terms of that, talks about dynamic risk assessment, the interconnectivity of risk. And so when we're doing risk profiles about strategic operational risk, we need to make sure that we're also talking about a connectivity in terms of your point, and we don't see it as a standalone. They do all in certain circumstances link together. So it's key to understand that. And in terms of integration, so what does all this mean from a GRC and an organisation perspective? So if you look at this picture here, you've got the holy grail of enterprise visualization of policy, risk and controls all in one place. Then we obviously have a GRC solution on the left-hand side, and then we've got data analytics, and we've touched on some of the capabilities there. Because of the immaturity in terms of data analytics and some of the capability challenges internally and also externally, is that what we always suggest is that there are certain use cases where you want to try and use the power of data analytics for your GRC capability. So for example, we've touched on DRA in terms of dynamic risk assessment. So in a GRC solution or outside of GRC solution, you may have a current risk profile based on 3x3 or 5x5 approach. Then you can take that out into other tools to give it a different view and a different priorities and import that back into the risk prioritization process. So use a different model, a different tool to educate you in terms of the importance on the risk. So you take it out and then you take it, put it back in. So that's one use case in terms of the risk. If we look at, in terms of one of the key capabilities a GRC tool should be able to do is actually identify and help you manage and monitor control and effectiveness of control. So we are seeing a lot more data analytics used to determine control and control exceptions in organizations, and that could be in terms of financial transactions and processes. So what we're using data analytics for is to prove in terms of where a test is operating effectively or where it's not. So for example, if you have an approval of £100,000 on a purchase order, we can make sure that that is actually flowing through the system correctly in terms of that level of approval. If there's an exception to that, that gets alerted. And what we find in terms of these capabilities, they get alerted, but sometimes something happens and something doesn't happen. So if you have alert from these tests and these exceptions, it should flow back into your tool to actually say that you've got a control deficiency here, this is an incident, this is an issue, this alert, it needs to be investigated, and then you use the workflow capability of a GRC tool to help investigate and follow up that control exception, that test exception. And then finally, in terms of one of the key capabilities of any GRC tool is about policy and adherence to policies and conduct. So if you've got a mechanism where you can assess what your trader's up to and look for exceptions, whether it be using data for phone calls, whether it be using data for emails, whether you're using transaction data, exceptions to deals that you're finding. Again, you have the ability to do that outside of a GRC tool to provide some insight. And then if you do have an incident where somebody has actually performed a transaction outside of policy based on your data analytics, you can feed that back into your GRC solution as an incident, and then flow that through the normal workflow, an investigation process. So you're starting to see a bit of end-to-end integration between a GRC solution and data analytic capability. And what we say, you always need to focus on 2 or 3 key use cases, in terms of what's critical to your organisation. So it may be the risk prioritization process is critical. It may be actually conduct analytics is more critical at this stage. Just depends in terms of what the drivers are behind your investment, whether regulatory, whether it be compliance, whether it be the board wants more visibility of strategic risk. I think what we find is that people try to do too much too soon, and when they actually just need to focus in terms of what exactly is going to deliver the best benefit. So any questions in terms of integration? In terms of how you see sort of GRC technologies and data analytics fitting together? Does that all make sense in terms of approach, in terms of the use cases? And it's probably the same with an overarching GRC solution. You always, ideally you want everything onto a GRC platform, but you have to start with a few key use cases first, whether it be compliance or strategic risk management, whatever it may be. So any further questions?
Did I understand it correctly that DRA it's more on a control time basis that you run the assessment to see how the environment is evolving? Or did you, well, I'll let you answer that and I'll come up with something else.
Yes, so it's more of a point in time. So you do the exercise at the start, and then depending in terms of the dynamic nature of your organisation, then you would select a timeline to do it every quarter or every 6 months or every year, depending on the nature of the environment. In terms of
because I thought that's what it was, and hence my question was going to be, so in such a situation, we have heard it this morning, and I totally agree with the velocity of change and quite a lot of the changes that we're seeing outside the organisational environment and even within it. How would it then, the method, how would it deal with a situation where environmental changes do occur pretty unexpectedly and you're kind of managing your risks and trying to deal with the correlation between those risks based on your assessment that you might have done a quarter ago?
So in terms of the, the core methodology of DRA resides if it's external risk or internal risks. So you need call it a horizon scanning mechanism to bring in some of the external perspectives. And these external perspectives can come from the industry, or it can come from other sources in terms of social media, etc. So you've got an external perspective view, then you obviously got the internal view as well in terms of risk, and then you can join that through the model in terms of join those together. So you can always get call it an external perspective as well as the internal view, and then just follow the model.
So in such a situation, if changes do occur, and perhaps in some of those cases the changes may impact differently those clusters of risks.
Yep.
Would you then suggest that the DRA assessment will need to be repeated just to evaluate the impact on those clusters?
What your risk depiction and the DRA is trying to do is show you where things may or not be aware of connections before. So if an operational risk matter happens and you hadn't expected to happen, you then will have the knowledge to understand how that could actually trigger something else in your environment as well. It's not at the stage where it's going to be a continuous monitoring tool to help manage it, because it's trying to look at a broad risk list. And hopefully if a risk event happened, it wouldn't actually generate threatening risk that you hadn't thought about, but it gives you the knowledge that actually if this has occurred, it could impact something else, and this is how quickly or slowly it can happen.
So you will need to do a refresh, but obviously it's not like across the board another exercise in terms of the complete DRA assessment. So you'd have to reassess the impact of that new external risk or internal risk on the overall connectivity. Okay, any other questions? No? Very good. Thank you all. Thank you.